Hey everyone, Mark Hayward here. Today we have another podcast release, another YouTube video release, which is an interview with Shaun Eli, who is a stand-up comedian. So this is a little bit different than we usually do, but he was a really great guest. I really got underneath understanding him and his process of being able to write jokes as well. But first of all, we're talking about his upbringing and his 20 years in finance, which is a pretty substantial period of time to have a career before you become a stand-up comedian. But he started taking comedy classes and his career trajectory just went up. So it's a really fascinating story. He talks about how to tell jokes, and he says about that he tells these best jokes when he's telling stories about the mundane things in life. So we then talk about his corporate gigs, his favorite place to play and to stand up. And it's a really wide-ranging interview and conversation about corporate, about comedy, about entrepreneurship. This is something a little bit different, but I really love talking to Shaun. I thought the guy was amazing, had a great breadth of knowledge, great understanding, and he's actually a really funny guy as well. So do enjoy the podcast. Also, if you're enjoying these YouTube videos, do hit the like, hit the subscribe, and hit the bell icon, and you'll get my updates every time there is a release. Thank you so much again for listening and watching, and I will speak to you all soon at the end of the video. Cheers. This is the Absolute Business Mindset podcast, created and hosted by Mark Hayward. This podcast will interview entrepreneurs, business owners, and people in their careers. We will delve into their journey to success, key life milestones, and go deep into their area of expertise. Get ready to learn from others' successes and failures. Today we have Shaun Eli, who is a stand-up comedian. Hello, Shaun. How are you?
I am good. Of course, just as you got started, my doorbell rang.
Oh, no. Oh, wow. Hopefully it's just an Amazon deliverer and it's not too big a deal. Shaun, right. First question is, what does business mindset mean to you?
I would say business mindset means thinking about making things efficient and customer friendly. And in my case, making my customers laugh as much as possible because I'm a stand-up comedian.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. Education-wise, so you did a degree in marketing and economics. Why did you choose that subject?
Well, I always thought I'd be a scientist or a doctor because that was my parents' focus. And I got enrolled starting probably by 10 years old in every possible science course or study my mother could find. But by the time I got to college, I was kind of sick of it. So I started looking for something else. And I started studying economics. It seemed interesting. And I moved into business. And then I would say I left business to be a comedian. But as a comedian, I'm pretty much running my own business.
Absolutely. It's very entrepreneurial, actually, because you've got to find leads. You've got to work out what's going to make you money, what's going to we'll talk about your successes of headlining and your jokes being in Forbes and on the Jay Leno show. So absolutely, it's a business, just like everything else. You have to make a living from it. So
it's really entrepreneurial because I'm not just people say, oh, you're a comedian, so you're a writer and performer. I'm also the stage manager, the wardrobe guy, the bookkeeper, the web designer, the marketing manager. It's everything.
Absolutely. So you then, after your degree, you went into a few financial roles. Was that just where you thought you should start as you'd done an economics degree?
No, actually, a lot of my classmates wanted to work on Wall Street, and that was something I didn't want to do. I wanted to work in marketing, but I was terrible at interviewing for jobs and couldn't find a job in what I wanted to do. I guess the marketing people figured, you can't sell yourself very well, we're not going to hire you to sell our stuff. So I ended up taking a job in finance sort of through the back door, and then just ended up being a banker for 20 years.
So why don't you think you were very good at selling yourself? Or marketing?
I just was never comfortable in job interviews. I don't know, just never worked out. the right way to do it. I didn't know how to dress properly for job interviews. I didn't know how to sell myself. I guess I was, I was raised to be modest, and that's not how you want to be in a job interview.
No, that's true. It's all about selling yourself, isn't it? Job interviews. But you spent 20 years in finance then. What did you learn from those roles?
I learned a lot about finance and money and Wall Street, and that I didn't want to do it for the rest of my life. I also learned that corporations are not always very nice places. I think a lot of times people become successful in business in a corporation because they're mean and they step on other people, or they bully and take credit for other people's work. So people who tend to be the more senior people in companies in a lot of institutions just are jerks.
So I spent about 15 years of my life in Big Four, and there's a mixed bag. There really is. There's a lot of if I say sort of old school sort of men that are very sort of alpha male. I actually worked in a technology area of the Big Four, and they actually there was a nice blend between the sort of alpha males and the sort of developers, the coders. And so as a team, it was actually really nice because you had this blend of people. But yeah, a lot of people in corporate are very happy to walk on other people. And the thing that I found in one of my roles and not in the other one was that there were win-win scenarios. In another role I had, it was definitely if I won, someone else lost, and that's a really difficult dynamic in a company, because then they're pitting peers against each other, and sometimes you need support as a peer. You don't necessarily always need competition. So what was your view, as you were in for 20 years, of sort of the competitive nature of corporations and businesses?
Well, it really depends on the institution. Some of the jobs I had were not that competitive, but when you're in a profit center, you want to be able to say, I generated this much money and my coworkers generated less. And one of the place I worked for 14 years, they didn't have good metrics to decide who was doing a better job, because there were so many different ways to measure it. So I had a colleague who kept track of everybody else's deals as well as his own. So at the end of the year, he could go into the boss and say, look what I did compared to everybody else. But he would measure it the way that made him look the best, rather than, trying to find an objective way.
Yeah, it's a difficult. It can be incredibly difficult, but we both spent a lot of time in there. Like 15, 20 years is a long time to work in companies and those sorts of environments. So what made you change from finance of 20 years into comedy?
The short answer is because I could.
Okay.
The longer answer is I went on a date with somebody, and she said, you're funny, you should try being a stand-up comedian. And I said, I like writing jokes, but I'm not really a performer. And she said, well, I took this comedy course and I think you should take it. And I took the course and started performing, and said, you know what, I like this. And started doing open mic nights and new talent shows, and I eventually started making money and said, I would rather do this.
So what was your first performance ever on an open mic or something like that? What was it?
The classes, there are a lot of comedy classes in the States. I don't know whether the UK works the same, but basically it's 4 or 5 or 6 nights over 4 or 5 or 6 weeks of being with other people in the class and an instructor and performing in front of the other class members. And that really doesn't count as a performance. And then there's a graduation show held at a comedy club, either on a weekday night or like a 5:30 or 6:30 on a weekend. And you're in front of only friends and family of people in the class, because nobody else is going to go to that show. And so it's a very supportive environment.
So you, yeah, go on. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, so my first show was in a packed comedy club.
Excellent. And I was going to talk about this later, but it's interesting what you said about the being trained and being taught about. So what is the process of the joke creation when you're thinking about jokes? How do you How do you work out the process of it?
That is probably the hardest question for me to answer, because I know some comedians who say, oh, I write an hour a day. I sit down and I write jokes, or I just have a train of thought, or random words I write down and I try to make jokes out of it. And some of those people are good and some of those people are terrible. So I don't know that that's the process. In my case, a lot of times I see something that's incongruous and I put, a standard late night TV monologue joke is 3 sentences, and it's the premise, the focus, and then the punchline, which is a surprise, and it's just putting 2 things together. And to give you a really bad example of that, when Donald Trump was president, somebody might say, Donald Trump and Putin met. One is a really tyrannical madman dictator, and the other one is Russian. That kind of thing. So, you think somebody's looking in one direction and then you focus it in the other direction. That's an easy joke to write. You just find 2 things that don't fit together and you put them together. For me, it's most of my comedy is stories. It's things that have happened to me in my life. And when I started in stand-up comedy, when I took the class, the instructor said, storytelling is the best. The big emphasis at the time, and probably still is make your comedy about yourself. Make it about you and your life, because nobody else can do that, because nobody has the same life. And that way you get a sitcom, because there's very little money in stand-up comedy for most people. When you get a sitcom, you become famous and then you make millions of dollars. And so if you look at Roseanne Barr or Ray Romano, they became famous because their stand-up was about themselves. So everybody said, tell stories about yourself. And I didn't think I had interesting stories. I thought I had a pretty boring life. And then as I developed more as a comedian, I thought, well, this thing happened to me and I can talk about that and make it funny. And about 20 years ago, I went to a wedding it was a Chinese American couple getting married. And almost everybody there was Chinese. And it was my then girlfriend's coworker. So that's how we were invited to the wedding. And there was nothing funny about the wedding. It was just a wedding. But I woke up in the middle of the night thinking, I don't know why I was thinking about it, because it was 10 years, before that. But I said, if I change this and this and this and this and this, then I've got a funny story. And the next thing I got out of bed and I sat down at my computer and I typed it out. And by the next morning, I had like a 9-minute story about a Chinese wedding. Totally fictional, but it was a funny story.
Fantastic. And and I hate to put you on the point, but one of the things that when I was doing some reading about you that you provided to me, you said that, as you just said, you tell stories and you create fiction around this. One of the stories that you referenced was successfully fighting a parking ticket. Can you tell us the story about that?
That's about a 9-minute story. Actually, every single word in that story is true.
Okay.
With one exception, where at the time it was local, it was in Philadelphia. The only thing that I changed about that story, and it's such a minor detail, but in the interest of full disclosure, is somebody was drinking a beer in the story, or there's reference to beer in the story, and it was a local beer in Philadelphia, and nobody'd heard of it, so I changed it to Budweiser. So people heard of it, but I got a parking ticket, and it annoyed me. My last semester in college, I got a parking ticket. And it annoyed me because I lived on a residential street and there were parking meters on my street. And I didn't think there should be parking meters in a residential neighborhood. I didn't have a driveway. Where else was I going to park? So I did what a scholar would do. I went to the law library and I looked up the law, and it defined a parking meter as no more than 4.5 feet tall. So I found that really weird. And I went out and I measured the parking meter and it was 1 inch too tall. So I decided to fight the parking ticket. And I'm shortening this and not making it funny, but I was found guilty. So I decided to appeal it. And when you appeal a parking ticket in Philadelphia, it's in criminal court.
No way,
So,
really?
Yeah, because I guess for whatever reason, that's where it is. So I make it sound like it's real criminal court in the story. It's actually criminal arraignments and parking tickets.
Okay.
So I go in, but nobody fights a parking ticket. It was $25. And so I went in to fight it, and I'm surrounded by real criminals. And to give you one punchline from the story, the guy to my left told me, he was arrested for beating his wife. He said that, and this is in the 80s, he said they wouldn't have bothered him, but it was the third time that week. That was Philadelphia in the 80s. The guy to my right said he was convicted of slicing somebody's face open with a broken Budweiser bottle in a bar fight. And I'm a kid from the suburbs. I can't believe that I'm in criminal court sitting between a guy who apparently exceeded Philadelphia's informal weekly wife beating limit and a guy who attacked somebody with a broken bottle of domestic beer. Because my great crime was basically that I ran out of quarters on a Saturday.
Oh, fantastic.
So that's a brief summary of the story, but it's like, I don't know if you're familiar with the song Alice's Restaurant by Arlo Guthrie, where it's a very American thing. Okay. He was arrested for littering in a very small town, and it was such a big case because there's no crime in this little tiny town, but they wanted to exclude him. He didn't want to be drafted. It's an anti-war song, but he wanted to be excluded from the draft, and he couldn't. And then when they discovered that he had a criminal violation on his record, they were going to kick him out of the army. And then it's like a 20-minute song, okay. And it takes place on our holiday of Thanksgiving. So American radio stations play this on Thanksgiving, so Americans are familiar with it. And my story almost parallels his story in what happens when you go into criminal court for something so stupid.
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of described it. I think I have the answer to this question, but how do you find humor in sort of everyday events, like going to the shops, or what are you when you're doing sort of mundane, normal things? Are you thinking in your brain how to sort of twist this to be funny, or do you reflect on things that you did in the day and then create the humor?
It's more the first. I think to be a comedian, you look at things sideways. You know, you look for the incongruities in things, and so many things are just ridiculous. And I can give you the example I use, and I'm assuming everybody will get the reference. Is I heard on the radio that father-daughter dances are becoming more popular. Father-daughter dances, or as Woody Allen calls them, dances. Now, because for a normal person, when you hear, oh, a father and daughter dancing together, you may think of, you know, your father and your sister, or if you're a woman, you may think of your own father, or you may think of your brother and his daughter. I hear father-daughter and my brain immediately yells out Woody Allen.
So
it's sort of just looking at things sideways.
Who are your comedy heroes?
Not so much Woody Allen anymore.
Okay. Yes.
not so much Bill Cosby.
I was going to say Bill Cosby's another one.
I didn't say this at the beginning, but the comedy class, when he talked about storytelling, he would play us Bill Cosby routines and say, this is a good storyteller, and this is how you do it. And when I started, I thought I would like to be a good storyteller like Bill Cosby. I eventually became a good storyteller, and I'm nothing like Bill Cosby.
Good. Good.
But I would say, you know, Robert Klein is a great comedian, but I could name some American comedians that nobody's heard of. They're not famous, but they're brilliant.
Okay, good. How did you develop as a writer to be in Forbes and New York Post and even to a point to the Tonight Show with Jay Leno? How do you get those sorts of gigs where you're producing jokes for newspapers or TV shows?
Well, the writing for Jay Leno actually was the first thing. So As a kid, if I thought of something funny, I wrote it down, and then I just had a box full of random pieces of paper that I never did anything with. But when Jay Leno got the Tonight Show, I would be, you know, on the train in the morning going to my work in the bank, and I'd be reading the newspaper, and I'd see a headline or read a story and think of something funny. And, you know, that would be as far as it got, or maybe I'd tell coworkers what I thought of that morning. And then that night, I would watch the Tonight Show, Jay Leno's opening monologue, and he might be telling the same joke. I'd be like, oh, I should write for him. So I called and I said, you know, I'm a writer in New York, which is technically true at the time. I said, I'm a writer in New York, and I think of some things that are the same style of humor and sometimes the same jokes that he's telling on the show. And I spoke to somebody for a while, and I sent them some information, and they gave me, and this is how long ago it was, they gave me their fax number. Right. And so I'd be reading the newspaper. I was the guy on the train. People thought it was weird because I'd be reading the newspaper and frantically scribbling notes on the newspaper. And then when I got into work, I would type it out, and I'd have a time advantage because New York's 3 hours ahead of LA. So by like 10 o'clock in the morning, I would have, sometimes one joke, sometimes 2 pages of jokes, and I'd fax it in. And if they liked it, they would use it and they'd pay me. If they didn't like it, then they didn't pay me.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So it was on not a commission base, but it was like if it was used, then you'd get paid. If you didn't,
right?
And so that was still while you were working.
While I was a banker, yeah. Luckily, nobody, called me out on it.
What do you find more rewarding? A good stand-up gig or a joke being used on TV?
Well, I'm not writing for TV anymore, but I would say a good stand-up gig, because that's all about me. Because if Jay Leno or one of the other late night talk show hosts tells my joke, it's my joke, but it's their platform. It's their show, and I would get paid, but I would get no credit for it. So absolutely, my favorite thing in stand-up comedy is thinking of a joke right on the way to a gig, and then trying it out when I hit the stage, when the joke is fresh in my mind and I have a lot of energy. That's my favorite thing to happen. It doesn't happen that often.
And you've headlined in 5 different continents.
Yes.
Wow. So this is
not Antarctica, and that's really hard. I've tried. I really tried to find a way to get there to perform. And everybody is like, we're not going to fly. The scarcest resource they have at the science, it's only scientists in Antarctica. The scarcest resource they have are the planes coming over. And they're not going to stick 180 pounds of person in that plane just to go over and make people laugh and fly home again.
Right. Well, you never know. Things get cheaper. They might fly you over.
Maybe I could fly. Maybe I could pay for
it. What is the Ivy League of comedy?
Okay, so when I started in comedy, I was working in banking. And I would perform in new talent shows at comedy clubs, amateur shows. And my coworkers and friends and some clients would come to the show. And they would say, you were funny and you were clean. The rest of the comedians, a lot of them were filthy. And we don't mind that, but we'd like to take clients to a show because it's a lot of fun. But we can't, because we can't take a client to a filthy show because somebody would, I might get in trouble. Where are the clean shows? And there weren't any. Okay. At least not, there's clean shows in like houses of worship and for charity events, but there were no clean comedy shows at comedy clubs in New York. And I said, there's a demand for this product. I can create a supply. So let me put together a bunch of comedians and I'll borrow the club for a night every once in a while and put on shows. And I needed a name for the group. And at the time, I think there were 4 or 5 comedians that went to Ivy League schools. And I thought if I called it Ivy League comedy, that would sort of sound corporate and fancy. And so that's what I called it for a couple of years. And then I was doing a show at a theater in Washington, D.C. And when we got there, the sign on the marquee said, they got it wrong. Instead of saying Ivy League comedy, it said the Ivy League of comedy. And I saw that and said, that's a much better name. So I changed it.
Fantastic. And is that do you still do that now?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Excellent. And is it the same comedians?
It's not this. Well, there were like 5 of us or 6 of us who went to Ivy League schools. And I realized I can't just keep using the same comedians over and over again. So now it's not just the 5 or 6 comedians. There's about 35 of us that I work with pretty regularly. And we do shows, not so much at comedy clubs, more at theaters now.
Okay. And what is the role of corporate gigs? And so for example, when I was at university, which is like 20 years ago, we had an evening at the university, and they had an up and coming comedian, UK comedian. I can't remember his name, unfortunately, and he ended up.
You know what? That goes to show that most comedians are not good marketers, because I mention my name several times every time I'm on stage, just so people hear it over and over again.
And then this guy ended up being quite mainstream in sort of like the early noughties when I was at university. But what is the role of sort of students or corporate gigs and things like that? How important is that for you as an entrepreneur?
Well, for a lot of comics, university gigs are great because they pay pretty well. But I'm a little too old for that. Comedians do not, I mean, college students do not want to hear, unless it's somebody famous, they do not want to hear a comedian who's at least as old as their parents. They want somebody much younger. And I didn't start till I was 40. So it's unlikely that I would get a college gig. So I haven't really chased after them. I've done a couple, but for some comedians, it's great. Corporates are good and bad. They're good in that they pay well. They're bad in that sometimes the people don't want to be there, because if you've been at a corporate event, you know, an offsite since 8 o'clock in the morning, and then you worked all day, you listen to people drone on, and then you had a dinner and you're sitting with people that you're sick of. And then after dinner, instead of letting you go home, now you got to listen to this guy talk for a half hour. For some people, they'd be like, I'd rather go home and watch TV or go to sleep. So they're not always the best audiences, but sometimes they are. Sometimes they're a lot of fun.
And you're a keen rower, or you were a keen rower. Do you still row now?
I still row, but I stopped competing a long time ago.
And is that your sort of form of release, sort of exercise gives you? Is it a positive? Like, it's positive because you're doing exercise, but is that important routine for you?
I think it helps clear my head. The beauty of where I row is I've got 2,000 meters of water. It's an inlet off the Long Island Sound. It's basically surrounded on almost all sides by trees and rocks and almost no people. Mm-hmm. So, and I go out, everybody else who goes out, you know, before work. And I go out at 10 o'clock in the morning. So I have the place to myself. So I have inside New York City, this very isolated area to row. And it's beautiful and there's nature all around me. And I've got it all to myself. But less than a mile away is the NYPD outdoor firing range. So, and there's 40 bays of firing range. So sometimes I'm out in the middle of nature and then I hear what sounds like machine gun fire. So that's another incongruity.
Do you duck down, do you, just to make sure?
No, it's far enough away, but the first time it was weird.
Another story which I'm intrigued to hear about is the story about you selling your car to a hitchhiker.
Yeah, there's no joke there. It looks interesting in my biography.
It does.
But I used to work in Connecticut, and I had a diesel Volkswagen Rabbit, which I don't know whether they had the Rabbit
no.
there. They called it, I'm trying to remember the name. In other countries, they called it something else. It was a little 4-door hatchback.
Okay, yeah.
Darn, it's bugging me that I can't remember what else they called it. It was like a hatchback version of the Jetta, but the Jetta came later.
Okay. Right.
Anyway, so I was driving. I used to work in Connecticut, and I lived in New York City. And I was driving home from work one day, and I saw a hitchhiker, and he looked like a college student. I picked him up, and he's a college student, and he lived not far from me. And he said, "Wow, this is a great car. My friend has a diesel Rabbit. If I were going to buy a car, I'd buy one of these. And I'm probably going to be buying a car in a few months when I graduate." I said, "Oh, that's great. I like the car. It gets great fuel mileage." And I dropped him off. And then a few months later, I went to sell the car, and I remembered his name. So I called his school. He had too common a name to find in the telephone book, but I called his school. It was before the internet. I called his school, and I tried to get in touch with him, and I couldn't. And then a couple of weeks later, I'm driving, same route, same time. I see the same guy. I pull over and I pick him up, and he said, "You've picked me up before. I remember the car. This is a great car." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I'm looking to buy a car. I'm graduating. And I said, do you want to buy this car? And I got very lucky because at the time fuel prices had dropped and nobody wanted a noisy, stinking, clattering diesel. But I sold it to him cheaply enough that he was happy, which is lucky for me because nobody would have bought it.
I was going to say, did you get a good price? You're saying that it wasn't great.
I got a price. Well, now that I think about it, because a few months earlier, gas prices were high, fuel prices were high, and the car was worth $2,000. By the time I sold it to him, I could only get $1,000. But thinking about it now, it had 100,000 miles on it, and my father had only paid $7,000 for it. So that was not a bad price.
That's good. That's good. You've written for satirical essays, and so what is the art form of being satirical? Is that a different sort of mindset for you to sort of like story-based jokes about your life? What's the approach when you're thinking in that mindset?
I hate to say I don't know to a lot of questions, but it just I think it's my point of view. I think I'm just looking for things to make fun of, and then I find them.
And what's your favorite? Is politicians? You mentioned about Donald Trump and things. Is politicians the best way to go when you're thinking that's kind of way?
Well, it's easy to write political jokes because something's always in the news and a politician is always saying something that can be made fun of. So that's a lot of my stuff for late night TV was political. And I would say back before Donald Trump, no more than half of a late night TV host's monologue was about politics. By the time Trump came along, that's all they talked about. And it got kind of annoying for me as an audience member to watch this because I was frankly sick of it. But that is for writing for other people. For myself, in the US, I decided pretty much when I started in comedy that I did not want to do political humor because you annoy half the audience when you do political humor. But when I was touring overseas, I discovered that as soon as people heard an American accent, they were very curious about where I stood politically. So I would almost always open with the Donald Trump joke. Okay. Because overseas, he was not very popular. So I had to get that out of the way.
Yeah. It's we've got a situation not dissimilar with the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who
I would trade 50 Donald Trumps for one Boris Johnson. And we have two people named Donald Trump in the States. You can have them both.
The thing with Boris is I saw something recently, and it was a interview that he did within a political conversation, and he said that if you act not necessarily the fool, but if he's very bumbling and sort of his storytelling is very confused, and it's all and it was really interesting because it was pre him being prime minister, and he said the art form is to keep everyone confused about what I'm saying, and then no one will care about the details of your decisions. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating from a politician point of view, saying that
that's horrible.
It is. I'm not. I steer well clear of politics. Although I did a politics degree at university, I steer clear of politics. But it is a really bad way of trying to convince people that he's a good guy because he's this bumbling fool. And what makes it worse is that it's a calculated tool that he's using in politics. So I'm not asking for your opinion, but in that sort of mentality, if you were satirically thinking about Boris Johnson, would you outline critiquing him, or satirically, would you critique his approach, or would you critique what he's doing?
It's very easy to critique an approach. I mean, just to give you an example, we have a really, really nutty right-wing politician in America. She's a congresswoman I think her name is Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she came out and she was trying to call Nancy Pelosi the Gestapo, but she said gazpacho. And everybody was jumping on that and making fun of how stupid it was and what an idiot she is. And my attitude to that is, you're letting people, I know, first of all, I speak for a living. So I know that if you speak a lot, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to say dumb things. You're going to get tongue-tied. You're going to bungle words. It's going to happen. So you're picking on her for being an idiot. And maybe she doesn't know the difference between cold soup and Nazis, but focus on what she's doing, not her poor choice of words.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I prefer, if you can make fun of something stupid that somebody did, you can make jokes about toilet paper sticking to Donald Trump's shoe, or Joe Biden tripping or stuttering. But if you actually want to change the world or have an impact, or at least be a little more intellectual, make fun of something with a little more substance.
Absolutely. I think that's a lot of comedians would learn from that, because, as you say, a lot of people do things on the slapstick, silly side of it.
It's easy. It's a very easy joke to run a clip of toilet paper sticking to Donald Trump's shoe or whatever, make fun of Boris Johnson or Donald Trump's hair. Those are easy jokes.
So where are you now on your sort of your career? So we've had COVID for the last, feels like forever, two bit years, and that's obviously sort of dried up the stand-up gigs and your headlining events and festivals and things. So where are you in your sort of business frame now with comedy? Are you writing more and sort of submitting that, or what's your approach at the moment?
Well, for the first, I would say, 6 months of COVID in 2020, I wrote jokes that I never did anything with. They just sat on my computer and I wasn't really performing. And then I live on a very social street in a small town just outside of New York City. And we would have happy hours, socially distanced, on the street. We'd show up, once a week or so, and the weather was nice. And we talked to each other because everybody was working at home and nobody had any social contact outside their family.
Yep.
So it was nice for us to hang out, and people would say, do some stand-up. And I'd say, it's not outdoor shows. I'd rather socialize. I'm here to have fun like everybody else. Then I thought, why not try out my material? I have all these new jokes. So I started trying out new material on my neighbors, and they really liked it. But during the pandemic, not in New York at the time, but there were comedy clubs open around the country in places that weren't paying attention to the pandemic. And some of my colleagues were going, and I thought, I'm not doing that. So for a long time, I did outdoor shows and a lot of virtual shows, and then, started doing shows again. And then when Omicron hit, I had no bookings in January. It just didn't work out. And I was upset that I had no bookings in January. And then I was glad I had no bookings in January because I could stay away from other people. So actually last night was my first in-person show of the year.
How did it go?
It went really well. I emceed the show. There were 4 comics. I opened. And that's always the hardest spot in the show because audiences really do need warming up. You think they're there to laugh. You're telling jokes. Why won't they laugh immediately? But it really takes time to get people in the mood to laugh. And so if you're only doing 10 or 15 minutes up front, it's the hardest spot. But it went well. I had a new joke about breaking up with women at funerals, and it went very well.
What's the plans for the next 2 to 5 years then?
To get rich and famous. I would like to resume touring internationally because it's a lot of fun. I basically pick a place I want to visit, see if there's any way I can do stand-up comedy there, and then my trip is tax deductible. So that's what I've been doing. So there's a lot more touring I want to do in Asia. I want to visit Vietnam and other countries in the area, maybe India, Japan, Taiwan, and more countries in Europe. I just have to find places that have a big enough English-speaking population that they can have comedy shows. I think the UK might have.
Oh, come to London. There's plenty of comedy stores and places there.
It's hard actually because If I go to Thailand or South Africa or New Zealand, I'm exotic. In the UK, you got a lot of American comics. I'm nothing important.
What's your favorite place you've visited?
Favorite place I visited to perform, I would have to say, is Ireland.
Ireland, right? Well,
I hope not stepping into a rivalry between two countries.
No.
You say no, but if you were Irish, you would say yes.
Yeah, absolutely. This won't mean a lot to you, but we're just going through rugby union in Europe, and it's something called the Six Nations, and we just play England. So I'm based in England. Played Scotland, and the rivalry is so intense that historic reasons or whatever. And then it's quite funny because then we're playing Italy, which is not such the history isn't so strong, but England then play Wales, and the intensity with the relationship between the Welsh and the English, and then we play Ireland and the intensity of the relationship between the Irish and the English. It's quite amusing because my father-in-law always said that, especially in this sort of scenario in the Six Nations in rugby, is that everyone hates the English because they're the historically the overlords, or however you want to describe it. And everyone's biggest game is against England. So when you say that about the Irish, like if you were talking to an Irishman, they would be offended if you said they were English or whatever. So
no, I didn't say they're English. I said they hate the English is what I meant.
Yeah, they do hate the English. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one because as I say, historically, sport-wise, especially because sport has continued where wars were many years ago. So the rivalry in sport is, especially in the UK, is very intense. It's very intense.
Oh, I can tell you a story about that. It's not really a sports rivalry, but the last country I toured internationally was Thailand, and there's a 7-day-a-week comedy club in Bangkok called the Koh San Comedy Club.
Okay.
And Koh San is the area of Bangkok which makes Times Square or Piccadilly look like the suburbs. There's activity on the street till 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. It's just insane. Right. And at the comedy club, the guy who runs it is a guy named Jonathan Sampson. He's from Boston, Massachusetts. And he has a whiteboard in the back of the room, and it has a list of countries on it and some hash marks next to each country. And he says, there's no 2 beverage minimum there. He said, if you buy a mixed drink, which is more profitable for him than beer, if you buy a mixed drink or you buy any drink for a comedian, you can either get a point for your country, which is meaningless. It's just the board. There's nothing. Yeah. You can get a point for your country or take a point away from another country. And he said, if you're wondering why there's so few points for Ireland, it's not because the Irish people aren't buying drinks. It's because they're all taking points away from England.
So thank you for that. So the plan is more overseas gigs, more writing as well?
Writing for me, not writing for other people, but more overseas gigs, and I hope bigger and better theater and corporate gigs. Amazing. I've been putting a lot of work into website optimization, because you get gigs because people find you, and people find you on the internet. Yeah. So I think Google might be the most powerful company in the world right now, because they really do decide what we see. Yeah. And so I'm working on trying to get my website, which is right there, brainchampagne.com. Yeah. I mentioned my name in a lot of shows, and I also want to mention my website, which has over 50,000 words worth of jokes. It's got over 2,000 jokes and satirical essays in addition to videos, and it's all free, of course.
Oh, amazing. Nice plug. Like it.
I studied marketing. Did I mention that?
Okay, we're coming to the end of the interview. I asked the same 6 questions to all of my guests. They're quick fire questions. They don't need a quick fire answer. I've been told they're a bit thought-provoking as well. You haven't seen these questions. They're all going to be natural answers. The first one is, what's the best decision that you've made?
I think the best decision I've made, and it was a really difficult decision, was to leave the security of a banking job, the security of the industry, and healthcare benefits and pension and retirement plan for something very uncertain and much lower paying, but tremendous satisfaction in what I do. I work for ungrateful people, and now audiences thank me, 3-4 times a minute. They're laughing at my jokes, and they applaud at the end, and they want to talk to me afterwards. So becoming a comedian was absolutely the best decision I've made career-wise.
Excellent. What's the best advice you've been given?
To a new comic?
To you, just anyone, whether it's a mentor, coach, friend, what's the best piece of advice you've been given?
I would say don't be afraid to take risks, especially when you're young, when you can afford to take risks. And it was funny to me that when I left banking, people would say, well, what's your plan B? What if comedy doesn't work out? And I said, I have no plan B, because I don't want to have the opportunity to say, things are tough, I'm going to go back. And I said, I am burning every bridge on my way out of town to make sure that I can never go back into banking.
Amazing. I think there's a lot of people on my who are listeners who have left corporate world, myself included, and never regretted it. Obviously, yes, as you say, pension and healthcare, which can be quite difficult and a little bit scary, but 90% of the people who leave corporate and are successful or manage, I think most people leave with happiness in their heart. So
but save money, because it's going to be harder than you thought it would be.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree. Who helped you most in your career?
Well, when you start out in comedy, you get most of your gigs not from bookers, but from other comedians you've met along the way. So other comedians who are a little more senior would say, hey, join me on this show. Or there's a saying in comedy, if you have a car, congratulations, now you're an opener. Because especially in places like New York City, comedians don't have transportation. So if you can drive somebody, they may hire you to open for them. And you may get only 5 or 10 minutes on stage, but it's 5 or 10 more minutes than you'd get if you weren't. So it's generally other comedians who help you out when you start out, and they may give you advice.
Right.
So the standard advice in comedy, there's 2 things. One is stage time is what makes you better. But also, don't be a jerk to other people is probably a really important piece of advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's for everyone in life, I would say. Do you have any regrets?
I'm not sure if I regret not starting when I was in my 20s, because if I'd started in my 20s, I would have been way more successful, or I would have failed miserably and not had the ability to say, try again. Because it is really tough when you start. When you're 20 years old and you have a bad show, you're miserable for a week. When you're 40 and you have a bad show, you have the wisdom to say, okay, let's see what went wrong and see if we can prevent it from happening again.
Just on that, so do you think if you'd have left, you hadn't gone into corporate and you'd started in your 20s, do you think the career trajectory would have been different to you starting at 40?
Oh, way, way different. Because comedy, especially now with television, is a very ageist business. And people say, oh, Jerry Seinfeld is on TV all the time. And I'm like, yeah, because he's Jerry Seinfeld. But you will never see somebody over 40 making a late night TV debut. It just doesn't happen, because the audience they're trying to attract is 18 to 34. Right. So if I'd started younger, I might have been a lot more successful. I might have gotten a job writing for a TV show. But I might have just tried it once or twice and hated it and been awful and never went back. Never go back. So I don't know.
The experience does help. I left my corporate job when I was 40. And although it's hard because for me, it was a certain lifestyle which I was used to and my family were used to, and making that change, you have to adjust and you have to, but I think if I'd have started, my regret is that I didn't start in my 20s as an entrepreneur, but equally the choices I now make are a lot more with wisdom than I would have done in my 20s. So yeah, thank you for your answer though. What are you most proud of?
I don't know. I was just profiled in the New York Times in December, and it was a great profile. I didn't love the pictures, but I mean, they're good pictures. A photographer is an excellent photographer. I just, you want to look attractive in pictures, and the photographer's interest is in being artistic and showing who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't give me the opportunity to use it that much as a sales pitch, but it was a great profile in the New York Times. So that's something. And getting on TV in minor spots here and there. But I think that, and just the fact that I get to perform for audiences, I get to make people laugh for a living. And I can't think of a better job than that.
It's a brilliant profession. Absolutely amazing. What does legacy mean to you?
I don't know. I would say it's unlikely I'm going to leave a legacy. I think when I'm done, a year later, nobody's going to, unless I'm famous, nobody's going to have heard of me, and I will just disappear. I would like to be famous enough that, I mean, there's comedians from, the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s that people still listen to and talk about. I would love to be that for the 21st century, but I think it's unlikely to happen. Wow. Unless, I don't know, maybe your podcast is a big part of that and we can make it happen. Well, come on, listeners, go to brainchampagne.com and email it to all your friends.
Absolutely. Share the knowledge and all those jokes that you've got on there. To my listeners, please do go to brainchampagne.com and check out Shaun's content, but please do. And lastly, where can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
Right there, brainchampagne.com. You can have, here's the thing. There's a comedian in America, Todd Barry, and he was doing a show, and he said, and he was reasonably famous. He said, somebody sent him an email and it said, to Todd or whoever reads Todd's email. And he's like, who do they think is reading my email? They think I have somebody whose job it is to read email. But most comedians, unless they're very famous, we're approachable. I've had high school kids write to me asking for advice. People just have general questions. We'll answer you because we only work an hour a day.
So just on that, before we close, we're going to close in a minute. What is your daily routine then? Because if you say like you're performing 1 hour in the evening in New York, for example, so it's all very close. What takes up, apart from rowing, what takes up the rest of your day?
Well, working out, answering emails, just managing the business is time consuming. But writing jokes, bookings, dealing with contracts, calling. There's a lot of cold calling at this point in my career. I didn't think there still would be. But, a lot of cold calling, a lot of the business side of it, answering inquiries, writing new jokes, rewriting jokes, sending emails. So we may joke that, it's an hour a day. But just to give you an example, I'm in New York. If I'm doing a show in Maryland, I might leave my house at 4:00 in the afternoon and not get home till after midnight. And that's 8 hours just on the gig, not to mention all the stuff I've done all day.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone is listening or watching, we're on YouTube as well and on Facebook. If anyone wants to book Shaun Eli, and go to brainchampagne.com and they can find
and I will come to your country. It won't be inexpensive to have me fly, but I'll cram into coach if I have to.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Shaun. Thank you so much for your insight into comedy and business as well. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.